Hi everyone, thanks to those who are already in. We're just going to give it a minute for people to keep filtering into the meeting. Okay, we seem to have plateaued with people coming in, so I'm going to assume that's what we're going to get as people can obviously join as the meeting's underway. So might as well make a start. Hello, you may know me. My name is Liam Duffy. I'm an advisor for the Counter Extremism Project, non-partisan, not-for-profit international policy organization, founded in the United States, based in New York, but with offices obviously in Berlin and the United Kingdom. I'm from the UK branch of CEP, as is very handsome gentleman who's on the screen, Professor Ian Acheson, who's my CEP UK colleague. Obviously, we are here, you probably are aware, we're here to talk about Ian's brand new book. So it's called Screwed, Britain's Prison Crisis and How to Escape It. There he is. I got it on Kindle, so I can't do that. I can't hold it up, I'm afraid. Got it a steal at 15 quid, which Ian, I think you owe me a pint or two next time we're both in London. But yeah, if you haven't already got it, definitely go out and get it. Apart from being superbly titled, it's kind of annoyingly good. I really wanted to not enjoy it, but it's very well written, and I hate giving Ian compliments, so take that from me. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give Ian a big kind of haughty bio because he's part of the CEP team. I'm not going to give him a big formal introduction, but you obviously know him as a CEP advisor. You probably know him from tweeting several hundred times a day. Potentially, I know him as just an inspirational colleague on a day-to-day basis. Never grumpy, never complains. Just always positive in his outlook. But Ian, can you tell us, before you tell us a little bit about the book, can you tell us a little bit about your pedigree when it comes to prisons? Why are you the man who had to write this book about what you assert is Britain's prison crisis? So you can tell us a little bit about your background there in prisons.
Well, thank you very much, Liam. Your checks in the post for that munificent introduction. Yes, we're both colleagues, and hopefully we're going to be able to open up some of the issues that I've talked about in my book this afternoon. It's afternoon here, but thank you all very much indeed first of all, for joining us. And we know you're all busy, but it's good to have your company, and hopefully we could take some questions, Liam, as we're going through or at the end, and hopefully make this as interactive as possible. The main purpose today, as Liam has said, is to talk about the part of the book that deals with violent extremism. But just to make the point that in the United Kingdom, we don't have terrorist prisons. The last actual terrorist prison we had was in Northern Ireland, which was closed down in the early 2000s. We have prisons here, high security prisons, that include our terrorist offenders. But they're obviously part of a bigger prison, and some of the problems that afflict prisons that I've talked about in the book are common to those prisons that hold terrorist offenders as well. And they would include things like demoralized staff, insufficient staff, inexperienced staff, and still fears about how staff are competent enough and confident enough to be able to challenge toxic ideologies when they are promoted in these establishments. And where you have severe overcrowding, you will also have a magnification of the sorts of grievances that terrorist offenders will pick up on, and they will exploit and utilize in order to recruit people to their side. But we'll probably get into that, a bit later on. I suppose when you talk about heritage, Liam, the answer to the question, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I interested in all of this? Probably extends back to my childhood. You can probably tell by my accent that I'm from Northern Ireland, and I was born and brought up near the border in Northern Ireland at a time when the ethno-nationalist conflict that was going on there, that was known as the Troubles, that burned for about 30 years and resulted in the deaths of about 3,500 people. When I was growing up, that was running red hot. So terrorism was a fact of life for me and many people like me. I grew up in a community that was traumatized and threatened with terrorist violence on a daily basis. And unfortunately, I know quite a few people who've been killed and families who have been robbed of loved ones through terrorist violence. And you know that includes violence against my community, which is a Protestant Unionist community, but also violence against Catholic nationalist community that was committed by people who believed that they were acting in my name as loyalist terrorists. So you know we had a very complex situation, very fraught, where I was growing up in a very abnormal world. Now you know I say that, and I want to try to explain to people the sort of dichotomy there, and perhaps how this has influenced my thinking on terrorism and violent extremism. Because at the same time as growing up in a place that was haunted by sectarian violence and disfigured by a securitized response to that violence, which included, you know, living very close to a massive army base where helicopters were taking off and landing all the time, or going to work in the morning and passing British soldiers who were camped out on the laneway down to the road because there was a threat against members of my family and so on. At the same time as growing up in that environment, I also had the most amazing kind of, you know, Enid Blyton style upbringing, where, you know, I was free to sort of roam everywhere, and some of the problems that restrict young people today didn't exist back then. So it's a very convoluted trauma that I am still trying to work through. And you might say, well, you know, this isn't the most psychologically healthy reason for becoming involved in this subject as I go through life. But I just want to mention that to be, you know, set it in a bit of context, and to also say that I'm continually learning about dealing with violent extremists. I've been either lucky or unlucky, depending on the way you look at it, to have been up close and personal with all sorts of different violent extremists in my career. And I think, you know, to give you a starting point and then to stop talking, perhaps for a minute or two. When I was in the prison service as a young governor, it was several months after the escape, very high-profile escape from a prison called HMP Whitemoor in Cambridgeshire, which you will hear probably more about later as we go through the book and we talk about terrorism. But it was this was a prison that was built to be escape-proof. And 2 years after it was opened, 6 IRA prisoners and London gangster made an extremely audacious escape from this apparently escape-proof prison. And they did so by conditioning staff and intimidating staff to such an extent they were able to smuggle Semtex explosives and a firearm and grappling hooks and all the equipment that you need to make a tunnel out of the prison in full view of people who are supposedly guarding one of the most secure pieces of real estate in Europe. So the psychological impact of managing terrorist offenders in custody shouldn't be underestimated. But the fact that I happen to be a Northern Irish prison governor in the Great Britain service at the time that this happened made some people in prison service headquarters believe that I could be something of an expert in going over to the United Kingdom's only terrorist prison, which was then the Maze prison outside Belfast, to see what could be learned, if anything, from how staff were protected from being conditioned by very sophisticated violent extremists who wanted to exploit power and space in order to carry out you know, their activities, including trying to escape. So that's probably where it all started from. And I'll probably stop there because there's quite a lot more of that tale in terms of, you know, getting to today.
Awesome. So yeah, you mentioned that you're a prison governor. So you've obviously had a career in the prison service. You've also been involved in other kind of branches of law enforcement and government as well, I think, over the years. We're obviously the counter-extremism projects. We're going to come on to extremism. I don't want to overplay this point before we get to that topic, but obviously you back in 2016 led an independent review into Islamist extremism in prisons rather than all extremism. It was very specifically on Islamist extremism, but we'll come back to that. Yeah, like I said, we are going to talk a lot about extremism, but as you rightly mentioned right at the top, we don't have specialist terrorists or extremists, convicted extremists prisons. They're part of the general prison population in most cases. So can you set the scene a little bit? You call in the title of your book, you call it a crisis, and you paint a fairly bleak picture of British prisons, which I think for most people are very much out of sight, out of mind. But am I right in saying that, you know, they're not necessarily as isolated from the outside world as people think? So yeah, if you could just paint a fairly vivid picture of what somebody might encounter if they were going to walk into, you know, either pick a British prison, which is particularly bad, or an average British prison.
Well, you know, it gives me no pleasure to say that the title of the book is well made. We are in a situation now where the simple physics of incarceration is completely undermining our ability to do anything useful with prisoners that we lock up. So, you know, to put it bluntly, we've arrived at a point in the last few months where we are locking up far too many people for the good that we can do them or the space that we have for them. So there's been a bit of an arms race, if you like, which includes, sentencing policy changing. So we're locking up far more people for longer for serious offences. But we're also locking up people who are habitual, low-level criminals, often criminals who don't commit crimes that are associated with violence. So I'm talking about drug addicts, for example, who repeatedly shoplift and so on. So we've got a mass of people who are being locked up, and the prison service cannot build its way out of this increase in prison population quick enough. So that's one aspect of the problem. And that has resulted in, fairly dramatic moves, emergency moves very recently, where the Secretary of State for Justice has had to authorize the emergency release of prisoners now up to 70 days before the expiry of the sentence the judge gave them, which society would expect them to spend in custody. Because if he doesn't do that, then there simply won't be enough room to get really dangerous people into prisons, where prison governors will be saying, we have no capacity left. We're locking prisons out. I think politically and ethically that would be unacceptable. So what the Secretary of State for Justice is doing now is the worst possible strategy to deal with a population crisis, apart from every other one of the alternatives. Now, that doesn't let him off the hook, or indeed this government off the hook, because the increase in population was foreseen years ago. And unfortunately, the prison service has not been able to build its way, quick enough out of this crisis. There are plenty of people who would argue, and I'm I suppose, a late convert to this, that actually what we should be doing is not building new and ever bigger, modern, gigantic penal warehouses for people. We ought to be changing policy, changing sentences, changing our approach. So we're only locking up people who represent a real danger to the public, people who've been convicted of violence, for example. Now, we're locking those people up now as well as all the other people who I believe don't need to be there. So the net effect of that is, combined with a recruitment and retention crisis of prison staff, there are far too few people looking after far too many prisoners in overcrowded, squalid conditions, where prisoners are locked up for 23 hours a day, sometimes, where training and fitness and readiness for release programs through education, through offending behavior programs, for example, in many prisons simply cannot function because we don't have the right number of staff available to do it. Just to sort of give you a picture of what's happening. As of last Friday, when the weekly statistics for the population are published, the system is running at 99% of its capacity. And even that 1% that's left isn't proper wiggle room, because if you can imagine, that's just the gross number of cells that are available. But if you're sentencing 20 men for burglary on Friday, it's no good having 20 spaces in a women's prison, because that won't do. So, the situation is exceptionally tight at the moment. And just to give you some more kind of meat on the bones there, let me see if I can get this right. So in 2010, before the government introduced its austerity cuts to the criminal justice system, we were locking up approximately 2,500 fewer prisoners. And we had 2,500 more staff to do that. So if you get to today, when we're locking up something close to 89,000 prisoners, we actually have fewer staff to deal with that than we did when the population was smaller. And when the austerity policy introduced by the government got rid of an enormous amount of experience by slashing frontline staff, this was an absolutely predictable disaster in motion, which is coming to fruition now. And that is that if you take lots of experienced staff out of our prisons very quickly, first of all, every metric of safety and decency and productivity went into the skip, to be blunt. And even though there has been some recovery now, there was an emergency recruitment of staff that started about 2017. It's one of the few things that I would recognize Liz Truss for doing, is finally being persuaded, when she was briefly Secretary of State for Justice, that we, had gone to such a level of diminution of frontline prison staff that we were coming quite close to widespread disorder. So there has been a process of recruitment of staff, but I would argue, first of all, those staff are far less experienced than the staff that they're trying to replace, even inadequately. Because looking after people in custody is something that relies on a whole raft of abilities, which are often, overlooked or ignored by people, thinking it's a very simple kind of job where you're simply locking and unlocking doors and counting people in and out. It's much more sophisticated, if it is to work for society, than that. So you've got a lot of people coming in, and I'm not joking you, 18 and 19-year-old kids coming in who've got no life experience at all, who've got very little in the way of, it's not their fault, but very little in the way of emotional intelligence, for example, to be able to read situations and people, often very damaged people, very impulsive people, very aggressive people, well. You've taken all that experience out, so it's no surprise, in my mind, why conditions have become so chaotic, and why, in particular, rates of assault are going through the roof. Assault prisoner on prisoner, but particularly assaults prisoner on staff. And this is why, or a large part of the reason why, people recruited as an emergency are leaving almost as fast as they can be brought in, because they're being thrown into the maw of what Prisons Union would call one of the most hostile working environments in Europe, and they're not lasting any length of time before they want to get out and do something that pays a salary of equal value, and that could be, literally working stacking shelves in a warehouse for Lidl and getting some overtime, other than being, basically, the state's punch bag. These jobs ought to be vocational, and they should be. And, if anybody asks me what's the job that had most impact in me in my life, and the job I'm most proud of doing, it is being a prison officer. So I'm not here to say, to sort of denigrate those people, even the new people who've been, hastily recruited. Everybody has to learn somewhere. The difference between their learning now and my learning, for example, when I joined the prison service and worked in as an officer, a unique therapeutic prison called HMP Grendon. The difference between then and now is I had lots of experienced people around me, first of all, who were able to correct some of the idiotic things that I was doing and be able to support and mentor me. And there was much more time to do that and much more stability to do that. Whereas now it feels like you're getting, badly recruited, hastily and inadequately trained teenagers being thrown into an environment that they can't possibly thrive in. And, to bring it back, Liam, to what we're talking about here today, this explains to some extent why, even in our high security prisons that are not typically overcrowded, they don't fall into the caricature of the squalid Victorian slum like Wandsworth or some of our big Victorian prisons. So they're often very recently built, but they are suffering from an acute staffing crisis as well. two of our prisons, HMP Whitemoor that I've mentioned, HMP Long Lartin in the Vale of Evesham, are dozens of frontline officers short of where they should be. Now, this is important because if you don't have the suitable and sufficient numbers of frontline prison staff clearly and confidently in charge, dealing with very dangerous and sophisticated people, you have a bit of a problem. And there's also another aspect of this, which was revealed last year when both of those prisons I've mentioned were inspected. The Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, who often gives us the only window into how these closed places, as you've said, out of sight places, are actually functioning, said of both of these establishments, they were filthy. In fact, he said Whitemoor Prison was the filthiest prison establishment he'd ever inspected. Now, Whitemoor Prison holds a very significant amount of our national security risk in this country, a very significant number of Islamist extremists. We might go on to talk about who are the terrorists and where are they shortly. But it's a prison that, as I've said, has been beset, with difficulties. And my simple observation about a place like that is, if you're not being able to empty the bins properly in a place that is as sensitive, and needs to be as well run as somewhere like HMP Whitemoor, what else is going wrong? What else much more serious is going on? Because it really is a proxy for the health of that place. And we need these places, as bizarre as they are and as unhealthy in many respects as they have to be, we need them to function properly to protect the people inside the prison, including agents of the state, who are vulnerable and easily available targets. And we might go on to talk about the experience of talking to staff dealing with terrorist prisoners in a bit. But we're also talking about protecting society. And the review that you talked about that we did, one of the things that I was very conscious of when I was talking about what our hypothesis was, which was that terrorist prisoners were not being well managed in prison, and the consequence of that included things like prison staff being taken hostage to be murdered and not to be live streamed, and a terrorist attack being influenced by or directed from prison. And unfortunately, both of those things have happened. We haven't, thank God, had the murder of a member of prison staff in Great Britain yet, but we came within seconds and millimeters of it in January in 2020. But we certainly have had people who've gone into prison, convicted of terrorist offences or adjacent to terrorist offenders, being radicalised and going out and committing atrocities outside prison. That's why it matters to get these places right.
Okay, yeah, let's come on to that. So the biggest chapter in your book is dedicated to extremism, which is fitting. Did you say 89,000 was the current prison population? Is that what you said?
I'm pretty sure it's about 89, yeah.
Okay. So I think that a year or two ago, some figures came out. It was about 200 or so convicted terrorists and a further 200 who weren't convicted of terrorism offences, but had subsequently become radicalised kind of on the inside. So it is a small portion of that 89,000 that we're talking about, but as you said, the national security risk is a massively outsized. The potential for impact is massively disproportionate to their actual number. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there, because you mentioned the various attacks. I think prior to the COVID pandemic, this was probably the leading kind of news item for a while, right? There was the Fishmongers Hall attack, Usman Khan, and then there was Streatham attack, very recently released terrorist. And around the same time, in early 2020, like you said, there was an attack actually inside HMP Whitemoor. So we had 3 attacks in a very short space of time. And then later in 2020, we had the Reading attack, which we only kind of put the pieces together much, much later of what had actually gone down there. But it subsequently found out that was an Islamist terrorist attack.
So let's try to join some of the dots there. We'll take three of those examples. So Kerry Sadala,
the Reading attacker.
Yeah, the Reading attacker. So he was imprisoned in a prison called Bullingdon in Oxfordshire, and he was just a few cell doors away from a notorious Islamist radicalizer called Omar Brooks. That was one of his pseudonyms. And Sadala, as you say, went on to murder 3 people in a Reading Park in an Islamist terror attack in 2020 and injure several more. And certainly in the inquest that has just concluded, there was a relevance drawn to the fact that he had been radicalized in prison prior to his release. That was a factor. Okay, Salman Abedi twice visited another notorious Islamist facilitator in prison, and he'd further telephone contact with him as he was constructing a suicide bomb that would murder 22 young people and maim dozens more in the Manchester Arena bomb attack. What was that, in 2017, I think? Sudesh Aman spent the whole of his sentence in HMP Belmarsh, associating with other terrorists, and he was in prison for a terrorist-connected offence, and he was regarded as such a risk in terms of radicalising others that he was frequently segregated. And despite being exceptionally high risk, he left prison because there was no way legally to keep him in, more dangerous than when he went in, and he was shot dead after he went on a stabbing rampage in Streatham High Road in the beginning of 2019, I think, or 2019. So there are three examples, and they all illustrate the failures and limitations of our current system of risk management of highly dangerous terrorist offenders. In each of the three inquiries or inquests that have emerged in relation to those examples I've given you, it was quite clear that some bits of the system, either the police or the security service or the probation service or other agencies, had bits of information that ought to have escalated the risk that these people were presenting as they devolved into murderous violence earlier, and could very likely have had an impact and caused a different outcome. You know, I could sort of go down a rabbit hole here and talk about risk management, but I think it's probably germane, and I think I mentioned it in the book. The risk management for terrorist offenders we have in this country is called multi-agency public protection arrangements, MAPA, and those arrangements were not designed for terrorist offenders. They were actually created as a result of an outcry over the further offending of notorious sex offenders who were released from custody. So that was the kind of gestation of the process. And basically the concept is that as somebody is coming out of custody and still represents an enduring risk, there are partners that are required to cooperate together in order to manage the risk of that person in the community. And that typically is the core partners would be the prison, police, probation service, and others then can be available or do get co-opted in, because obviously if you're managing somebody's release and their reintegration into the community, you might need housing sorted out, you might need psychological problems dealt with. You know, there are other agencies to connect with, particularly with terrorist offenders who are being released, who are taking part in something called the Desistance and Disengagement Program, which is designed to help them step down and to de-radicalize them if that is indeed possible, and so on. So you know, what happens is an alphabet soup of agencies get involved, and they are philosophically and organizationally different from each other. They're not even interoperative in terms of the IT that they use. They have very widely varying levels of experience. You know, you know, you mentioned Usman Khan, who's perhaps the most egregious example of somebody coming out being managed by multi-agency public protection arrangements who just fell through the cracks because agencies did not communicate critical intelligence to each other. In fact, it was worse than that. They believed that somebody else had told agencies that were oblivious to it. In the lead up to Usman Khan's permission granted to attend a rehabilitation. I mean, there's a grotesque irony here, a rehabilitation celebration in London, which he used as a theatre for his rage to murder two other young people before he was shot dead in London Bridge. And, you know, I sat through the inquest, many of the days of the inquests on Usman Khan's victims, and there was a catalogue of catastrophic system failures, which I believe are traced back to this dysfunctional multi-agency public protection system, where people weren't talking to each other, where the security service, for example, didn't even need to, when they did turn up at some of the meetings, managing the risk of this person, even introduce themselves. They were just people who appeared in the corner and then left again, and they weren't able to be co-opted into the group or required to cooperate, which the legislation supports for the other agency I talked about. So, I genuinely do not believe, and I think I've been, unfortunately, my belief has been confirmed time and again, this is the right way to manage people who are highly dangerous, often very complex, highly sophisticated at deception, disguised compliance in terms of their intentions and so on. It's not the right way to manage them. What we need is one single, in my opinion anyway, executive, national, high-risk management agency, where it's a multidisciplinary, not a multi-agency approach. You might have secondees from those agencies, but they all work under one auspices. And you've got rid of all the convoluted pipework and the dysfunctional handovers that are happening along the progress of an offender from pre-sentence reports to resettlement in the community. You get rid of all of that and you have one organization managing everything to do with that offender. So you have a kind of institutional memory of how that risk presents itself, how it's changed over time. Usman Khan generated 1,000 pages of security intelligence inside the prison that said that he was a bad man and he was getting worse and he had intentions to kill people when he was released. There's only one person in the prison, it seems to me at the time, who was a young female forensic psychologist who spotted this descent into further terrorist violence by Usman Khan, but she was kind of drowned out by a lot of people who were completely deceived by the idea that Usman Khan was a reformed character because he'd pulled the wool over naive and credulous senior managers. I always remember the words of one of the barristers that was representing the families when they were cross-examining prison managers who had participated in this utter charade that Usman Khan was a poster boy for rehabilitation. I remember the charge being put to senior managers by this brilliant barrister that in effect they'd been distracted by the sort of fairy dust was the terms he used that had that had adhered to somebody who was participating in an external university-led educational group, and he'd fooled everybody basically. And this is a problem still, I believe, where you still have people who I think ideologically are committed to the idea that we can reclaim people, terrorist offenders in custody. We must make every effort to do so, but national security, in my opinion, needs to be paramount, and we need to be much more skeptical about people who claim that they've been converted from ideological violence. It certainly happens. I've seen it happen. But we've got to be very careful about measuring that progress and testing that progress. Usman Khan went into Whitemoor Prison, high-risk Category A prisoner, and he came out exactly the same designation. It's very unusual for people to leave custody from a high-security prison at their release point. Normally, what you would expect to see is those people go down through the categories of prison from B to C to perhaps open conditions where they are tested. To make sure that they are trustworthy to be released. None of that happened with Usman Khan, and every single agency missed, a constellation of red lights across the dashboard. So I'm afraid if people say to me, have things improved in terms of our terrorist risk management, I would say to a small extent they have, simply because there was so much public outcry when Khan and then Sudesh Aman committed their attacks in 2018, 2019, over the Christmas period, that the government had to do something. And it did some important things like close some loopholes in sentencing. It meant that terrorist prisoners are in custody for much longer. I'm absolutely supportive of the idea that terrorist offenders should spend long periods of time in custody for the reasons I've described. But if you're simply saying to people, it's the quantity of custody that's important and not the quality, not what is actually done or offered inside custody, that is more important, I would disagree with them there. And I would even suggest that is probably counterproductive in terms of managing risk. We have to try to do things with people when they're in custody if they've been convicted of ideologically motivated offences. The first thing the state must do and should do is prevent them proselytizing their hateful ideologies to others. Again, if you're talking about high security, long-term prisons, which is part of the estate where most of our offenders are, you are getting charismatic, sort of rock star type Islamists in particular, jihadis who've come into prison having either been stopped upstream of a plot or having been intercepted after a plot, who are there, and they are surrounded by credulous, violent young men coming into custody, perhaps for the first time, perhaps for an extremely long sentence, because they're in that environment in the first place, who are searching for meaning and belonging. And they represent ideal prey for people who are predators who want to try to convert them to their cause. So that's the first duty of the state. And then the second duty is to try to look at the people who are there, who are convicted of terrorist offences, in a way that isn't that gets away from the idea we can give people a sort of generic psychosocial sheep dip intervention and then say we've cured them. Because if you look at and you know this as well as I do, Liam, if you look at the cohort of terrorist offenders we've got, and you're right to use the official statistics as of the 31st of December 2023, there were 244 people in custody for terrorism connected offences in Great Britain. Just as an aside for people, the vast majority of them, 65%, were categorized as holding Islamist extremist ideologies, and 26% were categorized as holding extreme right-wing neo-fascist ideologies, and then 9% were others. And we've got more people in custody now than we've had for terrorist-connected offences in the last decade, and the fastest growing part of that cohort are people who've been imprisoned for extreme right-wing offences. But what I was going to say, I'm doing a bit of a Ronnie Corbett here. Sorry, sort of going off.
Let's very quickly.
I will finish. I'll finish the point. What I was going to say is, as you know, they're a very heterogeneous group. Okay, so unfortunately, we don't have very much in the way of commonality of themes of these people who are going into custody. We've got, literally two-time losers and university graduates being convicted of terrorism-related offences. The important thing to do is not believe, simply because it's cheaper or it gets a headline, that we could do a kind of quick psychosocial intervention here. The important thing, and unfortunately the expensive thing, if we want to protect society into the future, is look at those individual pathologies. Look at the trajectory into violent extremism in order to be able to see what way you can intervene to reduce that dangerousness, at least if you can. And what I mean by that is, is it a psychological intervention, a theological intervention, a family therapy intervention, substance misuse intervention, a whole plethora of things impact on somebody's trajectory from hateful thought into violent action. And that's what we need to tackle. And I'm afraid we're still not doing that.
It's probably worth, I know you talked at length about Usman Khan there. It's probably worth just talking about some of the specifics of what happened here. So he was convicted of involvement in a very, very serious plot against the London Stock Exchange. This wasn't, somebody who downloaded Inspire magazine or Dabiq or something like that. This was in the kind of mid-2000s wave of jihadi plots. He served less than half of his sentence, if I'm not mistaken. And I think, was it Jonathan Hall's review, which maybe came out last year or the year before? As you said, there was plenty of intelligence on this. It seemed that inside prison, Usman Khan was a very influential figure still in kind of extremist circles. He was actively recruiting and radicalizing people. There was no evidence on the prison landing that he'd actually renounced any of his views whatsoever. Yet, as you said, he was kind of released straight from a kind of maximum security prison onto the street. Not only that, but was given kind of permission to take part in a kind of academia, voluntary sector-led initiative, which also was not necessarily for terrorist offenders. It was for what we might call ordinary crime. And was also given permission to travel to London for that, despite this large dossier of evidence that he was still committed to his extremist beliefs. So my impression is that there's from both your book and kind of looking at this a bit wider, I think you mentioned this, is there's kind of a bit of a desire to believe that people are de-radicalized or can change and stuff like that, combined with not really understanding the nature of, let's just stick with jihadist, a jihadist belief system here. This is not like another type of crime. Combined with quite a high level of demoralization and intimidation of the kind of the people on the front line, that may kind of all come together in this perfect storm that allows this to happen. So let's talk a little bit about what we know about de-radicalization. You mentioned was it healthy identity intervention and God, I'm forgetting them now. DPP.
Distance and disengagement program.
Desistance and disengagement program, DDP, excuse me. So what's actually happening with these prisoners? Like, is these things, if you're convicted of a terrorism offense, are these things obligatory? Do you have to take part in these? What is the nature of the intervention?
Right. I mean, basically, you can't be compelled to take
And
part in anything.
just before you go on,
Yeah,
we're at 42 minutes past, so and I want to get to some audience questions. So let's do some quick fire now.
Oh God, you're asking me to do quick fire.
I'm gonna crack the whip. What's happening
Right.
in terms of DRAD?
Okay, so the core program is the healthy identity intervention. I want to say something quite clearly about this. We still don't really know much about what stops ideologically motivated offenders from continuing to offend, because actually we don't know what the relationship between desistance and age is, for example, because this generation of terrorists is still relatively youthful, even the ones who have been sentenced to long periods in custody. So, we have to experiment a bit. And the healthy identity intervention was an experimental program. It has not, in my view, been properly validated yet. But we shouldn't criticize people for trying to do something where there is a void. Okay, so to cut things down, it's very difficult to know what impact a healthy identity intervention can take place in one of the most unhealthy places in the world, if you like. So you're taking people out of a prison landing, which is a fairly dysfunctional place, into a classroom for an hour or two, a couple of times a week or whatever, to talk about a better identity, and then you're putting them straight back into the identity or the environment they came from. So I think it's going to be very difficult to make something like that work particularly. I'm much more, as I say, in favor of, and this is why I suggested, which was a suggestion that was adopted by the government, that we have separation units for those most highly subversive offenders identified by intelligence. I'm talking about ideological offenders, Islamists, but also, I mean, that could be for neo-fascist offenders as well who are doing the same thing. Because obviously, what one set of ideologues learns from another. But anyway, to actually lift them and put them in a completely different part of the prison, totally incapacitated from their adherence. So you're creating a cognitive opening, to use the jargon, to be able to intervene and do something or try to do something with those people. And those are the key people to see if you can de-radicalize, because although you probably can't do it with the majority of people, you can certainly reduce the dangerousness, and you might have some good seeds in the end. People who actually recant their violence of the past, and they are more important and more useful than 1,000 security officers or government imams or whatever the kind of intervention is. So that's where I would focus stuff. The Distance and Disengagement program is a program that involves theological support and mentoring and getting around the prisoner when they are leaving custody, to be able to try to offset some of the problems that they will encounter as a released terrorist offender, because we have a securitized response in the main to offending here. So those people go back into the community after they've served the custodial part of their sentence, and they probably have extremely draconian license conditions. So if you're trying to get somebody away from a terrorist lifestyle, you need to do quite a lot with them to be able to support them and to be able to deal with, ostracization from the community and so on. So we need much more imagination when it comes to that. And I'm convinced, particularly with the British Muslim community, that far from being seen as or caricatured as wrongly as the enemy within sometimes by the mainstream media, they are our partners in helping people to reintegrate and reject terrorist violence. We need to bring them in much more. And there's probably a case to be said for communities that neo-fascist, neo-Nazi terrorist extremists come from as well. Although, as we've spoken about on many occasions, Liam, but not here because there's not time, there is no equivalence in relation to risk and threat between Islamist extremists and far-right extremists, as convenient as that might be for people who like to sort of say, one side's as bad as the other, for example. The body count doesn't lie, the plots disrupted don't lie, and so on. So, what these initiatives are trying to do is reduce dangerousness. I think we need much more in our armory to be able to do that, including the ways I've just described, to be able to manage that risk safely and to be able to, in particular, stop recidivism. Now, I know recidivism is often wheeled out, by the way, as a means of saying we don't need to worry too much about terrorist offenders because their reconviction rate is very low. And I'm always worried when I hear that because reconviction is not the same as stopping reoffending. There may be many people who've been released from, for example, if you use Islamists, from custodial sentences where their jihad, to use their terms, has been thwarted, who are released back into the community and subject, to lessening levels of surveillance and supervision, and who quite often could be, and I think probably are, still connected to their ideological roots. And we have no idea, frankly, whether or not that's the case. So I would be very wary of using that as a proxy for actually the problem isn't as big as.
I think it's also not just directly reoffending in terms of being involved in terrorist plotting, right? If we look at where jihadists have come from around Europe, it's often the case that they've come from, or they've been in the circles of people, in those early waves of jihadists who either fought on foreign battlefields or were imprisoned and kind of built up. But you mentioned kind of charismatic people. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? Charismatic preachers, but those people who've got that street cred, that experience of being in prison or on a foreign battlefield or both, played a massively outsized role in kind of recruiting and socializing a next generation. So I don't think it's as simple as, the actual rate of reoffending is low.
Yes, absolutely. It's the influence those people bring to bear. As I say, they're regarded as rock stars, in those communities, and how that influence gets projected outwards in places where you have lots of need for people, young people in particular, to make sense of the lives and to basically be able to explain the sense of grievance they feel. And ideological offending, ideological tropes are brilliant ways of explaining that your life is shit because, and here's a gang to join for safety. We haven't talked much about that. The pragmatic decisions people make when they come into custody to join the biggest group. And in some of our high security prison estate, not all of it, but some of it, absolutely clearly. And it's been said by the chief inspector, by academics, who've investigated this, by Jonathan Hall, who you've mentioned, who's a brilliant terrorism watchdog for the country, that this form of aggressive recruitment to Islamist gangs goes on, and that struggle for power and space is happening all the time. And we simply don't have the staff, to go back to my original point, enough of the staff or enough of the experience or enough of the leadership, frankly, from the top of the prison service to support staff to confront and combat toxic ideas when they are expressed. If we had sufficient staff, time, and space to be able to develop relationships with prisoners, including extremist prisoners, we don't over here do the sort of, and God forbid we ever do the US model of incarceration, which is gun towers on the outside and the devil take the hindmost behind them. We build our prison system on the basis of relationships. And we can't have those relationships because staff are too frightened, too fearful, or too few to be able to do that in our high security prisons. There's an enormous amount of intelligence that isn't being collected, that could be connected to an attack inside the prison, that could be connected to an attack outside the prison, that is certainly, as these power struggles go on, for religiously infiltrated gangs within these prisons, destroying the credibility of the state and its ability to be able to rehabilitate people, which is, one of the two functions of prison: punishment and rehabilitation.
Well, also to keep the public safe, right? That seems to be like, it's not
Well, yeah,
when there's
yeah,
I just say that because you mentioned sentencing guidelines before, and I think when after Usman Khan's attack, and the government reviewed sentencing guidelines, there was a bit of a, oh, we should invest in rehab, or or the recidivism rates were kind of cited as why this wasn't the right way to go, or it was seen as draconian and populist. And I always thought, there is an element of public safety here. It's not, prisons are not just rehabilitation or punishment. There is, like, if somebody like Usman Khan is too dangerous to be back on the street, then the prison is for them.
No, absolutely right. And just to amplify that point, prison is a place where we can talk to terrorists. I am a real fan of talking to terrorists, and I get quite a lot of flack for that. But we can't talk. It's an obvious point. We can't talk to dead terrorists. We can only talk to those who are alive. I made the case recently to the New Zealand coroner, or some officials working for the coroner, about the importance of being able to talk to Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch massacre perpetrator who murdered all the worshippers in the mosques in Christchurch a few years ago. Even if there is a risk that that person might use it as a kind of way of self-mythologizing or traumatizing victims and so on, every contact leaves a trace. You can always gain something from talking to these people, and your objective should be always, if we talk to people, if we communicate with them, if we persevere, no matter how difficult it is, over time, and develop a relationship, we can actually get intelligence, get information which will stop the next perpetrator from coming along, or allow us to spot him earlier.
I'm just gonna have a quick read of some of the audience questions. We'll get to these. I'm really glad, maybe while I just read them, you can just give us a quick, just a very quick insight or take, because I'm really glad you mentioned kind of gangs, Islamist gangs behind bars as well, because we've talked a lot about, like, the individual risk posed by potential terrorists, for example, or the efforts that have gone on with individuals. But you also talk about intimidation of prison staff, and I think again, in what little information we have that's coming out of prisons, there's a suggestion that almost this Salafi jihadism emerging behind bars, which is not just about attacks, but like they're kind of holding Sharia courts, they're doling out Sharia punishments as they see it, almost implementing what ISIS was trying to do in the Middle East, but on a very small scale on prison landings. Is that a fair reflection, and what is being done, if anything, to break that up? And while you say that, forgive me if I look rude and disinterested because I'm reading the Q&A.
No change. Okay, no, there is certainly a continuous struggle for power and space inside our high security prisons, and that happens in microcosm, and it can be as small as a landing being cleared of people because the Muslim emir, in inverted commas, of the wing has come to talk to the senior officer in a very reasonable way to say, look, there are people who are cooking bacon here in one of our little kitchen pods. Lots of high security prisons have kitchens where prisoners can cook their own food because it's seen as a bit of a perk for good behavior. And so the pragmatic response to that, probably by the prison, shouldn't be, but is, well, let's allow that to happen to keep a quiet life, because we simply don't have the staff available to manage the disorder that might happen if it didn't. So you've got that de facto segregation. Now, I'm not suggesting that happens everywhere, but it certainly happens in 2 or 3 of our high security long-term prisons down in the south of England in particular, where recruitment's extremely difficult. I've mentioned Long Lartin, I've mentioned Whitemoor. You could add to that Swaleside and the Isle of Sheppey, other places. So it's a rational decision, basically. If you're coming into prison and you want to join a gang for protection, or some a sense of belonging or a sense of meaning and so on. That's why you have lots of conversions that happen in prison. Lots of religious conversions to Islam happen. I think disproportionate to the numbers involved. But some of that is because people who adopt a religion are doing so for good reasons, because there's something very powerful and redemptive about being part of a religion quite often, or joining a new faith and so on. but others will do it as a kind of stopgap measure to be able to identify with the right gang, because the gang clearly has power in that environment. And excuse me, we've talked about Jonathan Hall as well, and the report that he did into terrorism in prisons clearly stated that things like Sharia courts were actually happening. So you've got the authority of the state being completely undermined and opposed in those places, and staff withdrawing, and a new power base forming, and that's extremely dangerous. And we're at a point where, frankly, if we were to try to challenge some of the things that are going wrong in prisons, we haven't talked about drugs at all. Actually, the crime terror nexus is another issue that we need to talk about, and that, and not for here, but the confluence of serious organized crime nominals in high security prisons who have access to lots of resources outside, for example, and ideologically motivated offenders who have got the capacity to cause violence, and so on. Yeah, we haven't talked about how those dynamics work, and they impact on gang dynamics inside prison as well. So it's a very complicated, probably very fluid picture. But you are certainly seeing things happen now that traditionally would be completely inconceivable. And what I'm saying there, for example, is I've received credible information that a sex offender who converted to Islam, who could not function safely, such as the opprobrium sex offenders are held in, to the extent they have to be segregated in vulnerable prisoner units. Some of those people are now walking around in normal location where they couldn't conceivably have survived 5 minutes before, because they're under the protection of Muslim gangs. So the dynamics are being changed quite dramatically. I don't want to over-egg the pudding here, because it's not happening everywhere. And it depends really on, again, whether you have sufficient and suitable numbers of prison staff clearly and confidently in charge of their environment, and the leadership that would nip that sort of thing in the bud. But sometimes when you're managing these very highly complex places where instability can kick off at the slightest opportunity, you've got loads of people with very poor impulse control who are exceptionally violent there. You have to take the pragmatic route, the path of least resistance. Unfortunately, I don't think that serves us in the long term, because it allows these gangs to develop undue influence and power over those areas that they control.
That's a fascinating point that you mentioned about the sex offender. I think it underlines the challenge of something like de-radicalization, right? Because it's and you see this with people who maybe convert to, or we could say find Islam, they convert to Islam, but what they're converting to often is like a Salafi jihadist variation of Islam behind bars. So you use the word moral universe in your book, and I was really glad to see that, because it's something that I've used as well. I know you probably stole it from me, but
probably did.
Probably. But that's what we're being confronted with here. If you're inside that ecosystem, which is holding the Sharia courts, doling out the Sharia punishments, you're inside that Salafi jihadist ecosystem. It's the outside world, which is ignorant, sinful, criminal, morally degenerate, right? And you live every day, 23 hours of your day is spent in that ecosystem, and then maybe you have a 1 hour with a therapist or something like that, and then you go straight to that ecosystem, and it's no, that therapist or that intervention provider is themselves living in sin and criminality and is morally degenerate, not you. Your life before finding Salafi jihadism was criminal and morally degenerate, but now you're kind of morally perfect, or you're on the right path at least, and that seems to me a massive qualitative difference with treating this as just any other crime. Anyway, I didn't want to set this up because we really need to.
I mean, the thick end of that wedge is divine permission to murder children.
Yeah,
so that's where that continuum takes you to. I am perfect. My world is perfect. Everybody else is degenerate. That produces the people or the person that blows himself up in Manchester Arena, full of children going to a concert.
Yeah, and that person is not merely was a liberal Democrat one day and just took a slight deviation. They are in a different moral matrix universe, however you want to put it. So one of the first questions we got through, hold on, I've just lost it. Ekaterina C is saying, well, you paint a pretty bleak picture. These are not her words, those are mine, but you paint a pretty bleak picture both of the crisis inside prisons, but also when it comes to extremists. how do we get people in government, in the criminal justice system, to kind of implement the changes to reverse course? And I guess like the corollary, my own corollary to that question is like, how do we make people care? Because we have talked about how prisons are very much out of sight, out of mind,
Mm,
right?
mm, mm.
Until there is an Usman Khan, it's not really in people's consciousness. So there's that question. Phil has also asked about, so obviously the UK has experience of dealing with terrorists, prison population in terms of the IRA, but also
Mm.
loyalist terrorists as well over the years. So we talked a little bit about how jihadists, Islamist terrorists are different from ordinary criminals. Is this a different type of challenge? Are there lessons we can learn from that kind of IRA era? In fact, are there still IRA terrorists in British prisons? That's a question I don't know the answer to. So if you can take those two, and then I'll
Okay,
finish
you might need to help me because I have the attention span of a gnat, unfortunately. But
I know that.
to take the last question first, there are no IRA terrorist prisoners at all in prison because two things happened. In the run-up to the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement, prisoners who were convicted of terrorist offences in Great Britain were repatriated back to Northern Ireland. Many of them were in the Maze prison, and then all prisoners were released following the 1998 agreement, which was a very contentious and very emotional issue, particularly for victims, obviously. But all those terrorists were released, subject to some license conditions, but as a condition of being able to make the agreement. So what you have in Northern Ireland now are a small number of dissident, what are called dissident Republican terrorists, and those are irredentist extremists who have rejected the Good Friday Agreement and who continue to try to typically target and murder Northern Irish police officers and conduct, a very low level, but still potentially lethal form of insurgency. And there are a small number of them, and they are held actually in a separated unit in another prison called HMP Maghaberry, because the Maze prison has been closed down as a result of all the prisoners being released from it. And they're very problematic to manage and deal with as well. And actually, just to go back to a point, Liam, if I may, one of the reasons I didn't recommend terrorist prisons or terrorist units was actually looking at the experience of the unit that I've visited on a number of occasions in Maghaberry prison that I've talked about. And my sense was we should try to keep terrorist prisoners dispersed amongst the mainstream. That's the dispersal theory that basically governs how these high security prisons and GB operate. That you've got a small number of very dangerous people and a large number of less dangerous people. The idea being their influence is lessened. But what I did say was, what you need to do is target those terrorist offenders who are the most highly subversive offenders, who are, intent on undermining security, and you need to isolate them. So, to answer another question I think has been asked, I don't think we've a great deal to learn basically from the Northern Irish experience, except we still are grappling with here the best ways to stop people becoming involved in violence. That's for another day, I guess, Graham. Liam, if we talk about the prevent strategy and our experience, and you and I worked on a contribution to the Shawcross review of the prevent strategy, which is the strategy, the UK part of the counter-terrorism strategy that aims to prevent people from being drawn into violent extremism in the first place and divert them from that. I don't think we've got that right, and we certainly don't have that right still in Northern Ireland, where we've a lot of work to do in poor communities in particular, where there's violent extremism is still mythologized and is still seen as a kind of heroic thing to do. So we've a lot of
you can see
there.
that walking around some neighborhoods. Yeah, just to remind you, let's do this as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Serena's question was about how can we make government criminal justice system care enough to, or how do we persuade them to make the changes that you would recommend? I'll also add, how do we make the public care, the electorate care? Just answer that as quickly as you can.
Okay, so it's an unfortunate fact that the biggest changes that we've seen and the biggest improvements have been as the result of terrorist atrocities. And I'm afraid I don't really see much prospect of that changing, frankly, because, Liam, there are no votes in prisons. Unfortunately, people don't care about prisons until they become a victim of somebody who's been sent into a place where they've been made worse, addicted to drugs, made more violent, been released, and then you've encountered them on the street. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is. There's quite a lot of stuff that we can do. Just to remind you, as a bit of an advert, this
Have you
book
got a book
says
out?
Britain's prison crisis and how to escape it. So I'm not actually that pessimistic, because I think I've got lots of practical recommendations. Please do buy the book. Within that book, to say how we can escape from the crisis. And there's no time to talk about them now, but they're all in the book. And I
What
think
a
the
great teaser.
situation is serious. It's not out of control. It can be fixed.
No, that's a great teaser. People have to read the book to find the solutions. No, I should have said that up front. You do say it's a crisis, but you do offer solutions.
Yeah.
And actually, just quickly to say, although you paint a fairly bleak picture, you, as you said before, you do not denigrate the frontline officers. You're quite critical of people in leadership and management
Yeah.
positions, but you don't question the people on the front line. Just the last two questions. I have put my email in the chat. Ian, if it's okay with you, if people I can't get to all the questions. I'll if people want to send them through, and maybe I can forward them to you, and we can get back to people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll answer all the questions.
Great. So just two very quickly together. One is from our colleague Edmund, which is kind of cheating, but I think it's an interesting question nonetheless. He talks about religious, there's religious instruction, mentoring, theological interventions going on in prisons. How do we know that that's not, in some instances, potentially aggravating the problem? I'm thinking back to previous iterations of policy which have said that, Salafism or even Islamism of the type of Muslim Brotherhood type of Islamism can act as a kind of firewall against jihadism, that kind of mentality. I know that doesn't exist anymore, but potentially there's still, do we know that there's not, people with the views that we might disagree with in those positions? And then another question from Dev. You talked about cultural competence in prison staff, talking specifically and potentially about disguised compliance, so pulling the wool over people's eyes. Do you think that could be solved by more, people with more theological knowledge, more Muslims in positions of leadership, that would be able to better, have that kind of cultural touchstone to be able to understand a bit better what's going on there, and potentially, you might argue, not have that kind of sensitivity that somebody who's not a Muslim might have.
Okay, very quickly. Good questions. On imams, one of the findings that I made was that the vast majority of imams that I've met did not have the capability, and some did not have the will to confront violent extremism where they found it.
That's quite a stark finding.
Yeah. So what's happened since that, to be fair, is the government have announced that they've recruited, I think, 45 specialist counterterrorism imams. And they've deployed them across the prison. Now, whether or not they are regarded as government imams and, are therefore ostracized, I don't know. And I wonder if there's ever going to be some research done into that, because I think it's an important point. Because it's such a distributed religion, Islam, it's very hard, or sorry, it's very easy, I think, for people who've been accused of taking the wrong path to respond by saying, well, you've got no authority to tell me that. So I think that job's very difficult. I have met, by the way, just can I say, some of the most insanely brave people I know are Muslim imams who have done exactly the job that you would expect them to do, to go in and to oppose some of these ideologies, and have suffered greatly for it. So those people are to be applauded. Whether or not that works or not, I don't know. Because there's always that possibility that they are perceived as being connected to the state, and Islamism is completely opposed to Western Judeo-Christian liberal democracy. So it's going to be quite difficult squaring that circle. Disguised compliance, yes, I think we can make a lot of progress on disguised compliance. We need to look at, first of all, the type of people who are doing the therapeutic intervention. So they need to be from a diverse group. They do need to have some religious competence. They need to not indulge in what I would describe as an affirmatory approach. I was a bit worried by some of the feedback from the early healthy identity intervention program that basically seemed to be saying a metric for success for this healthy identity intervention, after we've looked at it, is that prisoners liked it. you know, and you know, sophisticated prisoners, and I've met them, and my colleagues have met them in the review period that we're talking about, who came out of prison were basically saying, we told these people exactly what they wanted to hear, and they were laughing. These are released tact offender terrorists. We were just laughing between ourselves because it was quite clear what was needed here. You know, and I think, you know, we've got to tighten up on our naivety here when we're dealing with very dangerous and potentially very devious people, because I think, you know, there's a difference between people who don't have perhaps formal intelligence and people who can be very cunning. And sometimes when you've got a cadre of people who are middle class, you know, professionals, predominantly white, for example, that's when I would talk about the moral universe away from the sort of hip hop second generation jihadi terrorists. It becomes more easy to see how deception could be part of that relationship, especially when you do have a bit of what I would describe as reclamation theology involved. That idea, Liam, that you were talking about in other terms earlier, where there's a kind of, dare I say it, a kind of white savior complex going on, that these people can be rescued. Sophisticated and ideologically committed terrorists will exploit that, and do exploit that, unfortunately. So, you know, very brave people working with some of these individuals, don't get me wrong, you know, but they could be better supported, better trained. And I think the doctrine could be improved, because disguise compliance is a feature and has been a feature in terrorist atrocities, not just in the UK, but across Europe.
Okay, we've gone a bit over time, but I thought it was worth getting to some of those questions. Again, really sorry to the people I didn't get to, but drop me an email and I'll get those over to Ian. And he promises he'll answer them if you buy the book. Other than that, thank you so much to everyone. And thank you, Ian, and thank you, Marco, our colleague, who's, as ever, working very hard behind the scenes to make sure that this happened. Ian, apart from go out and buy the book, have you got any final words?
No, except to just thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. I hope it's been useful and helpful. I'm not a pessimist. I think there are a lot of things that are wrong with the system generally, but those things are all fixable. And it's our responsibility as people who work in this area, Liam and I and Edmund, who's joined us, and others, to do everything that we can to influence government or anybody who will listen to bolster our efforts to combat something that is, you know, proportionately quite a small threat in relation to the number of attacks and so on, but has a disproportionately massive impact on morale and perceptions of public safety. And if unchecked, actually does the terrorist work for them. In other words, it stimulates ever more draconian responses to the threat, which of course is what the terrorist wants. He wants a society, or she wants a society, which is unsafe, which is restricted, which is cowed. And every day that we work, Liam and I and Edmund and others, we are working to frustrate that end. So there will be others in the audience that are doing the same thing. So I salute you too. And thanks very much indeed for your attention this afternoon.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. We'll throw this up on YouTube as well, so look out for that. Thank you.